Well, good morning, Grace Way. I'm going to ask you to take your Bibles. We're going to get right to work in Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, beginning in verse 26. We are just really getting started in what I think is a pretty fascinating study of this gospel written by a medical doctor by the name of Luke. And last week, we looked at this same passage of Scripture that we're going to look at again this morning because there is just so much here that I would like to talk to you about. Let's begin in verse 26. And in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God unto a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And the angel came in unto her and said, Hail, thou that art highly favored, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. And when she saw him, she was troubled at his saying, and cast in her mind what manner of salutation this should be. And the angel said unto her, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there shall be no end. Then said Mary unto the angel, How shall this be, seeing I know not a man? And the angel answered and said unto her, The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the highest shall overshadow thee. Therefore also that holy thing which shall be born of thee shall be called the Son of God. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her, who is called barren. For with God nothing shall be impossible. And Mary said, Behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word. And the angel departed from her. And Mary arose in those days, and went into the hill country with haste, into a city of Judah. Now, there's a principle that I want to establish this morning, and it's simply this. God delights in working through real people, people like you, people like me, not because of us, how great we are, but in spite of ourselves and all of our weaknesses. Anybody here see the old 1998 movie with Cameron Diaz or something about Mary? It's okay to admit it. Just curious. Several of you have. And that was the movie. This morning is the reality show. There is something about Mary, and no disrespect meant by the picture of Mary, the iconic Mary that I've chosen to place on the screen this morning. We're going to talk about that in just a second. What our objective is this morning is to take the iconic Mary, who is laden down with centuries of tradition and sometimes, quite honestly, legend and myth and whatnot, and see if we can peel that back and discover the real Mary, the Mary of history, the Mary of the Bible, the Mary that is still very relevant to our lives even today. She is an amazing woman. We learned last week, taking a biblical look at Mary from this very passage, that Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the fact that she was highly favored of God, literally filled with grace, that she is presented here not as the dispenser of grace, as she is often portrayed today, but rather as the recipient of God's grace. That she is an amazing example for us of faith, not to be the object of our faith, which is to be reserved for God alone. So this morning we want to take a look at the Mary of history and see what we can learn from her. And the first thing that I need to tell you is that the Mary that we see often depicted in medieval religious art is not necessarily the Mary of the Bible. Now, we're all familiar with art like that. I'm an art lover. I love the art. So this is not a put down of religious art of the Middle Ages or anything of that nature. It's fascinating. It's very important historically and in every other way. But what happens is oftentimes because we have visual images in our mind, We read things in the Bible that we don't fully understand because we are blinded by what we've always heard and what we've always thought. And what our goal is to learn what the Bible really says. And so when we imagine Mary, we often imagine her, as we have seen her countless times depicted in art. She's usually presented as probably somebody in her 30s with perfect complexion, perfect hair. She probably has blue eyes, and she's got perhaps a crown, and maybe even in addition to that, a halo. And she is many times presented even as larger than life. Many times in religious art, you will see her 2 or 3 times the size of other human beings around her. And of course, that's designed to be iconic. That is a symbol to show her greatness and all of that. So again, I'm not trying to give you an art course this morning. What we want to do is to learn the reality of Mary, who was quite contrary to the typical image that we have today of teenagers, which she was. Now, this is what I want us to understand. The Mary of reality was not a 30-year-old mother. She's a virgin. That's mentioned here in our biblical text. She has never known a man. But rather than being a 30-year-old mother in regal clothing with perfect hair and a golden crown and halo, she is, in all probability, what we would call today a middle schooler. And I'll explain that in just a second. But while we're here, let me say that in spite of the fact that she is a virgin at this moment of history, the Bible teaches she does not stay that. In Matthew chapter 13, would you look there with me for just a second? Jesus had half brothers and half sisters. I say half brothers and half sisters because Mary and Joseph went on to have other children. Some of them are also mentioned in the Bible, as we're going to see. That is not to diminish anything from this moment of history that we're reading about in Luke chapter 1. But in Matthew chapter 13, we have some of the Jewish leaders speaking in amazement of Jesus, and they said in verse 55 of Matthew 13, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? 4 of his brothers are named. And his sisters, are they not all with us? Whence then hath this man all these things?" And we're not told how many sisters he had. He had plural sisters. Typically in Hebrew culture, names were not attached to women in genealogies. They did not count as men did. And so it's quite typical that they would have said, well, we know his brothers, and they list 4 brothers by name. And oh yeah, he had sisters too. Now, that's all part of the culture that we're trying to understand a little bit this morning. But almost every serious Bible scholar believes that Mary would have given birth to Jesus when she was either 13 or 14 years of age. 15 would be absolutely the edge. And the reason for that is because people in the first century, in this particular culture, married very early. Highly unusual for a woman to be 15, 16 years of age and not married. If that was the case, then she was a spinster already, you might say. She was very much fearing her biological clock and all the things that we talk about today and her own relevance at that particular time. Quite typically, she would marry a young man who would be maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 at max years older than her. There's exceptions to that, of course, as there are to just about everything in life. But the point is, in this particular place, at this particular time, it would be unthinkable for Mary to be older than 13 or 14 years of age when she gives birth to the Lord Jesus, what we would call today, just to keep it in perspective, a middle schooler. She would look perhaps more like this rather than what we saw earlier. Now, this particular picture that we put on the screen is a middle schooler. She's 14 years old. She goes to Graceway. She's Brooke DeWitt. I think she makes a very nice Mary. But we put Brooke up there because she is 14, and we wanted to just give you a visual image of what perhaps Mary might look like if we could actually see her in history. And it's just something that we need to think about. Now, probably by this time, because Mary and Joseph are already officially engaged, And as I said last time, engagement in this culture was as binding as marriage. Once you were engaged, the only way that you could become unengaged was to get a bill of divorcement. So this means an engagement usually lasted no longer than a year. So keep in mind what's going on here. You have a middle schooler who is very excited about planning her upcoming wedding. Already the two families have come together. Probably she and Joseph have known each other all of their lives. And probably these two families have been knowing each other all of their lives. And you'll see why in just a second. But at some point in time, there was a celebration that was held in one of their homes. And friends and family members from all over the village of Nazareth were invited, and a celebration took place in which the engagement of Mary and Joseph would have been formalized and celebrated. And so it's a very festive thing, and there's a great deal of anticipation. Now, it's very important to keep in mind what we saw in the very first verse I read this morning in verse 26. She and Joseph come from the village of Nazareth. Now, this is an actual photograph of Nazareth from the 19th century, the 1800s. That is what Nazareth looked like at that time. Now, we've got another photograph from a similar village. This was taken not that many years ago, and I put it up on the screen because photography has improved greatly since the 1800s. And so the definition and resolution is quite a bit better. But I want you to notice that really not much has changed. This particular village is right across the river in Jordan, but it's very similar to Nazareth. Listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. From the days of King David, 1,000 years before Jesus Christ was born, until roughly about the 1950s, Palestinian, Israeli, Middle Eastern villages had not changed at all. It's only been in the last few decades that modernization has begun to come to the village areas in this part of the world. Now, we're not talking about cities, we're talking, in fact, you can see, as this is, not that many years ago, there are still villages like this to this day. Now, to put all of this in perspective, the city of Nazareth, as it's called generously in the Bible, is no bigger than our church parking lot. That's why I said undoubtedly Mary and Joseph have known each other all of their lives, and their families have known each other all of their lives. There were no more than a few hundred inhabitants of Nazareth at the most. Perhaps 200 or 300, maybe 100 more. We don't know. But we do know it was a very small village and continued to be a very small village until about mid-century, last century. It began to grow. There's several thousand inhabitants today. It's grown up. There's another larger city just about 4 or 5 miles down the road, Sephora, which also existed, by the way, in the days of Jesus and was the big town in the area, but it wasn't Nazareth. Nazareth was, as we would say today, a one-horse town. They were poor. They were not wealthy. We know that because when Jesus is taken to the temple, and we'll see this a little bit later, to be circumcised on the 8th day, Mary and Joseph offered as an offering not a bullock or a ram or a lamb or a goat. They offered turtle doves. And when you go back and read the law of Moses, that was the offering of people in poverty. That was the offering for people who simply could not afford anything else. Now, there's considerable evidence that Joseph went on to become a pretty respected contractor in his day. In fact, we even have some historical documents that are believed to be a contract between Joseph to build a synagogue in Capernaum some years later. Very interesting things that we learn from history. But at this particular time, they're not yet married. They're both in their teens, and they're about as rich as most kids in their teens today. They don't have a lot of resources. Now, so Mary then was not sitting on a throne wearing a crown. She was a peasant girl in simple dress who carried water from the one well in Nazareth, which Still exists to this day, by the way. One well is all it was. And we've got a picture up here of that well in just a second. It's a little adorned from that time. We'll see if we can get that up here in just a second, or maybe it's already been up there. I don't know. But anyway, it is a very, very simple place. And not only that, she lived in a home that would have looked somewhat like this. This is a fairly large home. It's an artist's depiction of a four-room home. You can see a courtyard area behind the wall, and then you see that in addition to the lower level, there is a cutaway upper level. You know, we might call that a split ranch today in Kansas City. Here's a cutaway of the same type of arrangement. You can see in the lower area, or the family room area, as we might call it, there is a place to cook food in the open. There is an upper level where people may have slept, and you can see in the lower level, you can see animals present, because here's what would happen. Every night, all of the family's animals would be brought into the house. If they had a cow, if they had a donkey, if they had chickens, or if they had lambs or goats, they would come into this area at night and actually sleep with the family. If you can imagine that. You say, well, the smells must have been horrific. Well, they also added warmth during the winter months, because there would be no running water, no electricity, none of those type of things that we sometimes take for granted. In fact, the typical home averaged about 500 to 700 square feet. Now, to put that in perspective, that's about the size of 2 average motel rooms in America today. And families of 10, 15 people plus their animals would have lived in that space. This is what it looked like. And you can see, in fact, we've got some pictures up here of some interior shots. Here is the interior of a courtyard today. This is where people still live today. Same architecture, same layout, same system, still bringing the animals in today. And here's another shot, kind of a cutaway, where you can see the upper level where a lot of people would have slept, kind of a guest room area, upper level, then down below where the animals would be brought in the evening to spend the night. And then we have something else that's kind of interesting. This next shot is an actual archaeological excavation that this picture was taken in 2009. This is the excavation of a home in Nazareth that dates back to the days of Jesus. This home was there when Jesus was there. For all we know, it could be his home. We don't know. But it just gives you a little perspective, a little idea of where Mary lived. Now, I'm saying this because when Mary got upset with her parents, she did not take her guitar or iPod and go shut the door to her room. She didn't have a room. Mom and Dad did not have a room. Grandma and Grandpa, who often would live with them, did not have a room. Any cousin or uncle or aunt that was living with them did not have a room. Nobody had a room. Everybody was all together, including the family animals. It's just the way it was, and, oh, by the way, it's just the way it still is in many places in the world today. Get that fixed in your mind. What we have done is we have read our culture into Mary, rather than doing our homework and saying, let's find out what Mary was really like. What does the Bible really tell us? What do we learn from history and all of that? In all likelihood, Mary was illiterate, because it's unthinkable for most women in the first century to have any type of education. Now, maybe she did. We can't prove that, but 99.9% of the women in the first century did not have that advantage. So she is a young lady who walks around on dirt roads with dirty feet and sandals, and rather than sit on a throne, she sits on a stool by the fire. Here in Luke chapter 1 and verse 27, we read earlier, to a virgin espoused to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. Now, I'm reading this because Joseph is a descendant of the royal line. And we'll talk about that later when we get to the genealogy of Jesus. But they didn't make too much of that at this time. As we said, they were poor. It would be kind of like you studying out your genealogy on genealogy.com and finding out that you were related through a 32nd cousin-in-law twice removed, that you have some connection with the King of Austria 300 years ago or something. Like, wow, I'm impressed. That's great. That's cool. So he was of the royal line. It's just that was not a very active thing at that time. Jesus, by the way, did probably have a rich uncle. You might remember from the other Gospels mention of a figure in the life of Jesus called Joseph of Arimathea, in whose tomb Jesus is buried. From the historical evidence that we have, Joseph of Arimathea is believed to be one of, if not the wealthiest individual in the Jewish nation at this particular point in history. He is a relative of Mary. So Jesus did have the proverbial rich uncle in all probability. It's not in the Bible that he's the uncle of Jesus, but we do have some historical records that would indicate that fairly strongly. Now, I'm not telling you all of this to in any way diminish who Mary is. In fact, my intent is exactly the opposite. I want you to understand that Mary is an amazing example, astounding example of spiritual maturity. Here's this middle school girl excitedly planning her wedding. Excited about that, as any young woman would be, reading Modern Bride or whatever it is that they did back in those days that would be equivalent to that. I don't know whether she's picking out colors or picking out attendance or whatever it was that they did back in this particular culture. We'll not dig that deeply this morning. But the point is simply this. One day an angel appears to her when she is still engaged and has not been intimate with Joseph. And the angel says, Mary, you're going to become a single mom. And it's okay. You're going to give birth to a holy thing, as the King James Bible translates the Greek, who will be the Messiah, God in human form. He will be the Son of God, not because Mary had sexual relationships with God. We talked about that heresy last week. That's not true. The angel explained when Mary said, well, how can this be? I've never known a man. And he says, the Spirit of God will be upon you. The power of the highest will come upon you. In other words, Mary, this is going to be a miracle. No one will ever be able to explain what is going to happen inside you. Not to you, but in you. And you are going to give birth to this child. Now, she may be only 13 or 14, but she's obviously as smart as any middle schooler today. She understands the implications of this. Who in the world is going to believe her? Then or later. We saw last week that even when Jesus is an adult, his enemies would sometimes slam him by saying things like, well, at least we know who our father was. In a village the size of our parking lot, you don't have a lot of secrets. And so Mary understands there are ramifications of this that will last the rest of her life. And she takes the script that she had written out for her life, and she gives it to God and accepts a new script. And in so doing, she's not idolizing marriage. She's not idolizing her personal identity, her comfort, or her security. She's willing to give all of that to God, in contrast to a lot of people today who spend their lives fantasizing their lives away. Never satisfied with reality. Always fantasizing about something else. Has it ever occurred to you that half the people who are married in this country want to be single? And half the people who are single want to be married? It's because we're not very good about dealing with reality. And we're probably less good about submitting ourselves to the lordship of God, to allow Him to give us a script for our lives. But the point is simply this: God can use anyone, anywhere, anytime that He wants. And He took a young middle schooler from the middle of nowhere to make her the mother of the Messiah. I'm flabbergasted by that. Dr. Luke, highly educated, very literate medical doctor who is writing for Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, a term reserved for Roman governors or people of that social category. And he's telling the story of Jesus. And no one in the first century would ever have dreamed or dared to do what Dr. Luke did. In the midst of mentioning Caesar Augustus and King Herod and Cyrenius, the governor of Syria, and all these other VIPs, Dr. Luke begins the story of Jesus by telling the story of two peasant women, Elizabeth and Mary. I promise you, any first century reader or listener of this story is going to have their mouth on the ground. Because women didn't count. If something happened with a woman, put a man into the story, make him up, do whatever. And Dr. Luke, who said, I'm writing because I've researched it thoroughly, I've examined all of the evidence, I've interviewed the eyewitnesses, and I'm putting this together for you, Theophilus, so that you can know the certainty of what you've been instructed. And this is what we get. Wow. Incredible. You know what that tells me? It tells me that God can use people like you and me, and that He wants to. He didn't pick Mary because she was better or smarter or more spiritual than anyone else, although she responded to God's grace in the most incredible way. Be it unto me as you desire. God, I'm your servant. I'm your handmaid. Here I am. Use me any way that you desire. How many adults could do that today, much less a middle schooler, and mean it and stick with it? Incredible. You know, we talked last week a little bit about Youth League and the 500 or 600 kids that we'll have around here starting next month, and the need for some coaches. And by the way, thanks to all of you who signed up to be coaches and assistant coaches and groundskeepers and officials and all of that last week. We still got some needs, and you can see them in the bulletin insert today. My point is simply this. If you're waiting around until you're perfect before you invest your life in a significant way, you're going to die without doing anything. Well, God can't use me. Yeah, He can use you. Yes, He can. In fact, He wants to. The only reason that He won't is because you won't let Him. He wants to use you just like you are and make you better and stronger and deeper in the process. It's your choice. Working in Sky Kids, we've been talking about this Take It Home initiative that we're kind of rolling out little by little this year to make this thing real at all levels of life. Now let me tell you a couple of things before we finish this morning. First of all, you need to understand something. Teenage is a social construct. I've been using the word middle schooler because it helps us locate Mary in our culture. But you need to understand there were no teenagers until just recently in history. No, I really mean that. Teenage is a creation of Western culture. Because for all the thousands of years of human history, and this is why when you go to a museum and see paintings that were painted back in the 17, 16, 1500s and before, you don't see teenagers and you don't see kids being kids. If you see kids at all, they are dressed like small adults and they look like small adults. And the reason for that is because that's what they were considered. As soon as a person got to a physical age big enough to accept adult responsibilities, they began to do that. Kids went to work early. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the adjective teenage appeared in the English language in written form for the first time in a Canadian publication, listen to this, less than 100 years ago in 1921. But a lot of you didn't know that. 2 decades later, the word teenager, the noun, hyphenated at that time, appeared. It was first hyphenated, then when it became more accepted, the hyphen went away. That's the traditional way to deal with new words. But all of this came about because of reforms in the early 20th century preventing child labor and mandating high school education for all. What that did is it lengthened the pre-adult years, whereas in earlier times, as soon as adult size was achieved, achieved, people accepted adult responsibilities. And now that pre-adult age was extended to about 18 or even later. And thus the teen years became something totally new, for good or for bad. And then we began to talk about that. First, in the 20s, we began to use teenage to speak of clothes and activities. About 2 decades later, against the backdrop of war and the Depression, the word teenager that is so common to us today was actually born. We don't know exactly who was the first person that said it or used it, but we do know that the first time the word teenager appears in print in the English language was in 1941 in Reader's Digest. And just kind of let that soak in for a second. Because what we've done today, we've allowed the teenager to remake our world. Every child, regardless of wealth or merit, can look forward to an age of vigor and independence. And that can be good, and it can be subversive, because what teenager enjoying freedom wants to submit to the authority of an adult and accept adult responsibilities? And so what we've seen evolve over just the past few decades is we have come to accept socially a new script. You're going to be a teenager. Go sow your wild oats. It just happens. You're going to be irresponsible. You're going to go out and get stoned, get drunk, sleep around. But you'll grow out of it, we hope. Just a phase of life. Only if you choose for it to be. Or only if you want it to be. Because even today, in many cultures of the world, young people who are Mary's age at this point are holding down adult responsibilities, adult jobs, and you name it. Africa, Latin America, Asia, all over this planet. Adolescence, we call it, well, it's just a hormonal thing. Well, it's pretty hormonal. I would agree with that. But you know what? It's not the last phase of your life that's affected by hormones, is it? You ever heard of menopause? So you want a free pass then too? Mid-age crisis? Oh, you know, you're going to be wrestling with hormones the rest of your life. So it's just a matter of how do I want to do that? Some of you are really excited about that. I've got your attention now. So we all go through stages. You say, well, Jeff, how do I tame my teen? That's my point. Make Mary an example, or Joseph, of spiritual maturity. A young woman who allowed God to pour out his power on her, and she was willing to turn loose of everything else. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we outlaw teens. Kind of hard to put the genie back in the bottle, isn't it? And I don't have a problem with that. I really don't. Man, you got a chance to just prepare for adulthood for a few extra years. I think that's great. You don't have to be weird and think, oh, Jeff's trying to say that we ought to outlaw teens and that, we need to put little, three-piece suits on, kids and all this type of stuff like they did in paintings. No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying you don't have to be weird. But I'm just simply saying, you can be 13, 14, 15 years of age, and you can learn to be responsible. If parent and child alike so desire, you can. It's a choice you make. And there are 13, 14, 15-year-old kids all over this planet today who are doing just that. You don't have to be strange, you don't have to be weird, but part of being a follower of Jesus is learning to swim upstream. You're going to be doing it the rest of your life. You better learn how to do it and be part of that. And that's really where I'm going with this. Adolescence and your entire life are what you make them to be. Adolescents can be just as responsible as adults, and they can be just as spiritual. You're going to learn some things about Mary in a couple of weeks that will just absolutely, I think, take you by surprise. Sometimes people say, well, I don't want my adolescence taken from me. Well, first of all, nobody is going to take adolescence from anybody because it didn't exist on this planet until the last century, and only in Western civilization. So be careful of that. And parents, speaking of being careful, be careful about setting ages with your kids. When you are 15, then you can. When you are 16, then you can. When you are 18, then you can, because chronological age does not equate to maturity. So when you set yourself up like that, you're setting yourself up for trouble. You'd better find some metrics that indicate maturity, not chronological age. Just a little Heloise hint for those of you that are parents. Be very careful with that. Nobody's going to take your adolescence from you. I didn't get to play football or basketball or baseball in high school. It was my choice. And I had coaches try to convince me to do that. But you see, I started working when I was 12. My family, like Joseph's, was a pretty established family in our community. Went back several generations, but we had no money. I thought it'd be kind of nice to have a little spending money, because that was just the way it was. So when I was 12 years old, I started working as a radio television repair person. And I did that for several years, and then I worked into putting up radio and television towers, you know, those several 100-foot things that go up into the sky. I started doing that when I was about 15. By the time I finished high school, I was a radio announcer. So I worked all the way through my adolescence. Nobody stole my adolescence from me. I honestly didn't have time to go out and rebel. I did some stupid stuff like we all do. But my point is, I really didn't have time to go out and get in trouble. And you learn to be responsible. I lived in an equivalent of Nazareth. I lived in a little city that had one radio station. I was the guy that turned it on every day. So if I overslept, the entire city overslept. I did it once. You ever try getting a teenager up? I learned how to get up on my own. I chose to. You can too. You don't have to be weird. You don't have to be strange. You don't have to, say, well, I don't like, no. You can be just as normal as anybody else, but you can be as responsible as anybody else. That's the point. Adolescents and adults alike, we create this thing called adolescence. But you know what? Here's the amazing thing. You are created in the image of God, and you have the ability to create or choose. And this is true all life long. I just started reading a book by an Indian philosopher by the name of Vishal Mangawadi. Amazing book. He was a student in India, and going to university, he was very much influenced by the determinism and psychology of B.F. Skinner. And on the other side, he had a very devout Hindu friend who was trying to convince him to buy into Hinduism. And he was not a believer in Jesus at the time. He was very torn by this. He came across the Bible, and naturally, he started in page 1. He started reading Genesis chapter 1. He saw that man was created in the image of God, and being a brilliant young man, he sat down and he thought, well, if I'm created in the image of God, then I ought to have the ability to create. This is what is different between me and my dog. My dog can't create. I am a human in God's image. I can make choices. I can create. I can determine things, because determinism only produces a part of us. Machines produce. Human beings create. You say, well, we're just advanced animals. Well, it's true that when the chemistry of hunger pangs begins to work, it draws us to eat. But you're created in the image of God. You can choose not to. You can choose to fast, even to death. Because inside of you is a core of freedom. You make the choice. One night, Mangawadi went home from college, and his folks weren't there. Nobody in the family was there. All the electricity in the neighborhood was out. He went into the house, and he tried to find the candles and the matches, but somebody had forgotten to put new matches out, so there were no matches to light the candles. And he was kind of frustrated. He thought, man, I've got homework to do. I've got to study. And so he just went into the living room and sat down on the couch. His dog came up and sat down with him, and he just began to think and reflect on some of the things that were going on in his life. And he thought, you know what? I don't think my dog's too worried about the lights and when they're going to come back. And I don't see my dog trying to do anything about it. Come to think of it, I could go out and rub a couple of rocks together, start sparks, get a fire going for light, but I've never seen deer in the forest who are rubbing rocks together. I've never seen cats and dogs get together and try to produce light. Interesting. Man has the innate ability to learn laws of nature, rub rocks together for sparks, or build nuclear power plants. We don't have to stay in darkness. Interesting that Jesus said he's the light of the world. We don't have to stay in moral darkness either. In Genesis 1, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And Mangawati said, so how come we can't do that if we're in the image of God? And then he thought, wait a minute. It is precisely what we do. Because it is with our words that we are able to learn, to read, to research, to teach science and technology in order to make light. We do create with our words. And then he thought, why is that? Did we just evolve in our capacity to use language, or were we made, as the Bible says, with the capacity of language because we are created in the image of someone who uses words and who is called the Word? Here's the point. You choose for your life to be what it is. You can sit and whine and complain about being victimized. Victimized by the school system, victimized by the church, victimized by society, victimized by politicians, victimized by years of slavery, victimized by this, victimized by that. Or you can make up your mind, I will make a choice. I will submit to God. I will let Him write the script for my life, and I will let Him give me purpose and significance. That's what we see in Mary. What an amazing young woman. A lot of people feel they have no choice. I just got back from India a couple of months ago, where there are millions of people who are locked into a fatalism. They think they have no choice, no way to improve their life. They have believed and bought into that lie for centuries. They are trapped by culture and religion. Parents, let Mary's story exhort you to not blindly accept this Western thing called adolescence. Bring your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord as the Bible instructs. Let's work together. Let's roll out this Take It Home initiative little by little. Let's help each other. Let's learn how to do this. Women, learn from Mary's story to be God's slaves. She had her own plans, her own dreams. She gave them up to give birth to a boy and raise him. And in so doing, she passed by all those years where she could have been experimenting with makeup and running around flirting and listening to music and sleeping around and all that type of stuff. I think she turned out pretty good. And not only did she give birth to Jesus the Messiah, 2 others of her sons wrote books that are included in the Bible, James and Jude. She had a pretty good career as a mom. But she chose that. She accepted God's plan. Men, we can talk about how women usually mature more quickly than us, or guided by biblical truth. You can learn to grow up whenever you doggone well please. Or you can choose to be immature into your 70s and 80s. And quite frankly, Mary demonstrates more maturity than a lot of people in our culture today who are in their 70s and 80s. We were created in the image of God. Do you know Him? God will give you the grace and the power, but we make the choice as to what we do with our life. You say, well, where do I start? I just gave you some examples. Sky Kids, Youth League, whatever. Teaching a class, doing this. I mean, wow, what will you choose? I want us this morning, let's just bow our heads in prayer as we conclude this study time. And I want us just to prayerfully